Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. Today's episode is a special one. This is my interview with the chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas, recorded live on September 20th at the SPEER Industry and Policy Workshop, their annual conference. As you probably know, the PUC oversees ERCOT and the transmission grid, fully regulates the monopoly transmission distribution utilities, and has power and authority over just about every part of the power grid. Gleeson was appointed chair earlier this year in January. Before that, he worked for the PUC for over 15 years, including as the executive director for just about the last 4 years. I enjoyed talking with the chairman. He's thoughtful, self-effacing, and refreshingly open to new ideas. As you know, I don't agree with everything the commission prioritizes or does, and I'm often quite vocal with my criticisms. So I give Chair Gleeson a ton of credit for agreeing to do this. And as often happens when people talk, it turns out we agree on a whole lot. Chairman Gleeson and I spoke about what his vision is for the grid over the next 5 to 10 years, the technologies he's most excited about, and whether changes are needed in the utility business model. We talked about Winter Storm Uri and what remains to be done to increase reliability and resilience in the face of potential future winter storms. We also talked a lot about balancing reliability and resiliency with affordability, something very close to Chairman Gleeson's heart. He worked on low-income assistance programs in his earliest days at the PUC over a decade ago. Of course, given we were at the SPEER conference, an energy efficiency organization, we talked about the importance of demand response and energy efficiency. And we got into communications and public engagement. The chairman is focused on making the PUC more accessible to Texans. In fact, the PUC will be in Houston on October 5th for what I believe is the first PUC meeting with all the commissioners outside of Austin in over a quarter of a century. We also dug into the Texas Energy Fund, and I asked the chairman if the PUC plans to allocate the funding approved by Texas voters last year to fund microgrids at critical facilities, an issue that's become more and more pressing after Hurricane Beryl, where many people died at critical facilities, including nursing homes and assisted living facilities. Those deaths might have been prevented with these voter-approved funds for microgrids at critical facilities. Again, this interview was recorded at the South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a resource, that's SPEER, at their Industry and Policy Workshop. As I mentioned, it's an annual conference. If you haven't been, I highly encourage you to attend. You can keep up to date about the event, about SPEER, and all of their work at their website, eepartnership.org, and their social media, which we link to in the show notes. One last thing here, I am trying to keep as many of these podcasts as possible free. To do that, I do need your support. If you can afford to support the Texas Energy and Power newsletter and the Energy Capital podcast, please become a paid subscriber today at douglewin.com. Your support really is critical so that we can keep doing this work. And one last thing, this was our second live recording of the podcast, the first where we were doing the recording ourselves, and it mostly went well, but we had a little snafu at the very beginning. So where we start, it's a little bit of an abrupt start. Sorry about that, but I think you'll enjoy this discussion and learn a lot about the direction of the power grid in Texas from the chairman of the PUC himself. As always, please like, share, and review the Energy Capital podcast. Really helps the pod, and I appreciate your support in expanding our audience. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. He's worked at the commission for 15 years, really understands the commission, understands the ins and outs of policy, and really excited to dig into all of that today. Anything else you want to say by way of introduction, Chairman?
No, I'm excited to be here. As I was saying to you, we don't get to interact too often, so I'm excited to kind of have a conversation, get your thoughts on some of this. I will say I initially, when I came up the stairs, ended up at the beer distributors. And so
you almost stayed over there?
Yeah, almost, and I may mosey on back over there after this just to see if they're sampling anything or if I can join that association as well.
An energy efficiency crowd or beer distributors? It's a tough call. Before we jump in, I also just want to thank SPEER. We're obviously, for those that are listening on the podcast, we are recording this live at the SPEER Industry Conference. If you were not here live with us, you should make sure you're here next year. It was going on yesterday. It was great yesterday. It's going to be great today. And of course, thanks, Chairman Gleeson, for doing this. I think it's really important for you to be here, for folks to hear from you, and for you to hear from them in this really important industry, sort of sub-industry within the energy industry, focused on energy efficiency. So I just want to start with kind of a general question. And if you could kind of describe for us, I do this sometimes on the podcast. I think it's kind of a good way to jump into this. If you think of the grid in like 5 to 10 years, and I'm hoping you could kind of describe this, like you've got energy people in the room, there's energy people listening to the podcast, but also listening to the podcast are some folks that just, because of Winter Storm Uri or Hurricane Beryl or just rising costs or climate change or whatever it is that kind of brings them to that. There's folks that are not experts as well. So both in kind of if you can, kind of a technical way, but also to a consumer that's not super into industry jargon and all of that. What is your vision for what the grid will look like in 5 to 10 years?
One of the things I speak about often, and I try to tell people in every speaking engagement I have, is we hear often about an energy transition, which implies we are somewhere and we're transitioning from where we are to where we're going. And, that may work in other parts of the country or in other parts of the globe, but in Texas, with the load growth that we see, I don't see it as a transition at this point. I see it as an expansion. And so, we don't have the luxury of deciding we, only want renewables, or we only want gas-fired generation, or nuclear is going to be the end-all be-all panacea that fixes everything. I don't think we have that luxury based on the load that I see coming to this state, which is a good thing, right? I mean, the governor, the elected leadership of the state want Texas to remain an economic engine for the country. So with that comes, a lot of people and a lot of businesses. And so I don't think we have that luxury. I see the grid continuing to I see us trying to continue to incent as many different types of generation resources as we can. I see us trying to, look at extra high voltage lines as we talk about the transmission needs of the state, which I think are great. I think, again, it's an expansion of everything. I had a conversation out in the hallway earlier about something I just really became aware of, the idea of looking at our system as far as reconductoring a lot of it. I saw a report yesterday that said some estimates are saying that if you look at the entire grid in the United States, some 65 terawatts of energy could be captured through reconductoring the system. So, we got to look at sustainability, affordability, reliability, and the intersection of all those three from a policy standpoint, I think are where we get the biggest wins and the biggest impact, and that's what we need to be looking for.
So for that, kind of moving towards, reliability, affordability, sustainability, you touched on a couple of them there with like extra high voltage lines, but what are some of the technologies that you're most excited about? And I'll do the disclaimer for you. Like, you can't say everyone. So if somebody's favorite technology is on this list, it's not that the chairman doesn't like it, but like, what are a few that you are particularly excited about?
Yeah. So, definitely, I think one thing that everyone seems excited about, that if you've heard me speak before, watching any of our open meetings, I've talked about, I think nuclear is something when I talk in the Capitol to folks, it may be the one resource that everyone seems to be in favor of looking more into, analyzing, and seeing how it could benefit the state. And I was just telling Doug, when I was driving in this morning, I was listening to CNBC, and Constellation just announced that they are going to look to recommission 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, which is something we never would have thought. And when I looked at the report when I got here, the reason they're looking to do that is because Microsoft is going to be an off-taker of that energy for their data centers, for their AI data centers. And so, we haven't really had discussions in this state about large-scale nuclear. It's more been around small modular reactors. But I would say that's the technology that's probably, I think if you talk to most people in Commissioner Glotfelty's kind of sphere of influence around nuclear and his working group, would say is, 8 to 10 to 12 years away. I think, the governor would like to see that sooner here. He wants us to be a leader in nuclear, but that's one place I think everyone is really excited about. The other thing, which we've talked about a lot recently at the commission, is looking at the need for extra high voltage lines. I think it's something, I know you, when we have spoken, have talked about the need for additional transmission and the lack of efficiency and the cost that we bear, that the market bears because of transmission constraints around the system. And I think to Commissioner Glotfelty and Commissioner Kobos's credit, they've led on the transmission issue. And, I think we're in a place now where there's real analysis being done on transmission, on what we need to do, how we need to change our planning process going forward. One of the crazy things that's happened in the last, year, I would say that at least has come to my attention is, we recently brought Lubbock's load into the ERCOT region. I want to say, don't hold me to this, I want to say it was somewhere around 700 to 800 megawatts. My chief of staff and I went and visited an AI data center site that's going to have 3 buildings. They're talking about that site alone being 1,400 megawatts, which is just wild.
And it can come on the grid in like a year.
It can come on, and they want to know that they're going to be able to receive power yesterday. They don't want to wait. And so, that's just such a new paradigm for our planning process. That's another thing, extra high voltage lines. And then, I know this is a discussion, a conference about energy efficiency and demand response. Not necessarily a technology, but one of the things I think we've been thinking a lot about at the commission is how you empower customers, and not just large industrial and commercial customers, but residential customers. I've had a lot of conversations with ERCOT CEO Pablo Vegas. This is something that he's really big on, trying to find ways to provide incentives and a structure so that residential customers can participate meaningfully in demand response programs, that there's access to energy efficiency money. My heart in that is really in the low income realm. One of the jobs I had, early in my career at the PUC was overseeing the staff that used to administer the Light Up program, which you all may be familiar with. It was, a low income discount for electric customers that was discontinued in, I want to say, 2016. Affordability is really important. And I think you hear a lot about affordability at the Capitol. I don't know if it's always focused on the most vulnerable folks. And so, I think looking at ways we can leverage public money to help in technology, to help customers with affordability, to help with research on emerging technologies, I think those are all discussions that I'm excited to continue to have.
Yeah, obviously really happy to hear you say that. And I think as you're talking about energy expansion, there's expansion of generation sources, there's expansion of transmission that's going to be needed, to your point about load growth. And we don't know how quickly the load growth could be materializing very quickly, but I think certainly as you're looking through 2030s, extra high voltage, I think a lot of folks don't understand. I don't think I fully understand this yet. I'm trying to learn more about it, but even I was doing I do these quick little plug, these little live chats during some of the PUC meetings, and Commissioner Glotfelty had said that extra high voltage gives you 4 times the capacity through the lines. There was somebody on the chat that was saying it's actually closer to 6 is what they're seeing in the real world. So I think when people think about this, they need to understand that if you're just trying to do 3, 4, 5 years out, okay, like maybe the 345 kV is okay. But if you're planning, as I hope you're thinking, and I hope everybody in the state's thinking about 10 years out as well, you need that extra high voltage. And on the demand side, there's an expansion to happen there too, right? There are a whole lot of customers out there that would like the opportunity to save on their energy bills. And they're across a lot of times you hear this repeated over and over. I've heard it very recently that like low income customers can't participate. They just can't do this. They can't participate in DR. I want to challenge that assumption. I think that there's absolutely ways for people to save on their energy bills. So, and I'll just give a quick shout out on energy expansion to our friends at Texas 2036. They've done a lot of really good work, folks that want to sort of learn more about that concept. I think they deserve a lot of credit for kind of getting that out there. All right. So I want to ask you, I don't think it would be right to have a conversation on something called the Energy Capital Podcast focused on Texas with the chairman of the PUC if I didn't ask you at least a little bit about Winter Storm Uri. I do think we're in better shape than we were. And I like to be very data driven. We saw during the winter cold snap in January, which I think they called Heather, we saw less thermal plant outages than we did during Elliott or Uri. There's critical infrastructure mapped. There's, there are some things that we have a lot more solar in the state, which, right, people forget this, but like during Winter Storm Uri, it was actually quite sunny during the power outages, right? So there's a lot of things that would make things better. But you have said I'm quoting you here. Let's see
dangerous.
I mean, I just think this is just common sense, right? We're not done improving the grid. We are continuously looking for ways to strengthen reliability and meet the needs of our fast growing state. So I just want to, like, what is your diagnosis of what happened during Uri, and what are those improvements you're looking at next?
Yeah, so one of the things I think was really a failing of the commission and the industry after kind of the rotating outages of 2011 is it wasn't a large penetration event. It was pretty contained, and because of that, we got through that 2011 session. We made some changes, and I think at least at the commission there was definitely I'm not going to say mission accomplished banner hung behind us, but I will say a thought of like, okay, we did what we needed to do to address that issue, and there wasn't really much forethought given to what is this grid going to look like going forward, and what may we need to do in order to ensure reliability going forward. And so I think the biggest takeaway from Uri is we've implemented, like you said, a map for critical infrastructure, which has proven extremely helpful the last couple of winters, particularly if gas is having an issue or electricity isn't receiving gas isn't receiving electricity, because we have a way to connect those parties so we can get that addressed quickly. I think the other thing is we pass those rules on weatherization, but we don't stop there. This has to be a continuous loop of iterating improvements. And so, as our resource mix is changing, as our load is increasing, we are going to have to continue to look to make changes to ensure reliability on the system. The other thing I would say that is where the pendulum has started to swing back the other way, I would argue post Uri, in the trade-off between affordability and reliability, the pendulum swung all the way to reliability. And I think that was needed because for a long time, I think that pendulum had swung towards affordability. We were operating on the edge all the time to keep costs down. I think now 3 years out from the winter storm, I think you see this at the commission, you definitely see it at the legislature. Discussions about affordability have started to swing that pendulum back towards what I would argue is probably its rightful place, somewhere in the middle, depending on, kind of the dynamic, actions that are going on at any given time, where that trade-off needs to be between affordability and reliability. And so, I don't think you'll continue to hear discussions about reliability with also an eye towards affordability and what those trade-offs are. The other big thing I will say is the establishment of the Texas Energy Reliability Council, TERC, that's headed up by Chief Nim Kidd. We used to have an informal process between industry, the Railroad Commission, TDM, the PUC, but formalizing that process, having those folks get together in a room, talk about changes, talk about what they're seeing in the different industries and their regulatory environments has been really helpful. And I think you've seen a lot of success and a lot of good policy come out of areas where there was alignment from all those groups. Obviously, there's not going to always be alignment between the gas and electric industry on a lot of different issues. But I think where there is alignment and congruence and our goals are all kind of in the same direction, I think we've made a lot of really good policies that have helped this grid stay reliable. And hopefully, those groups will continue to help inform our policy going forward so we can, like I said, iterate on an ongoing basis to make sure that the mistakes we made leading up to and during Uri don't ever happen again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, during Winter Storm Heather, the recent one, while things were better than during Elliott, they weren't perfect. There were outages, and it's not, is that ever going to be perfect? So I think that spirit of continuous improvement is really, really key.
And I think that's important, right? Because Heather ended up being a different type of event, right?
Yeah, it wasn't Uri.
That's right. You end up having distribution issues, or it's never going to be exactly the same. There's not a one size fits all. Here's the playbook for in a winter storm. This is the checklist of what you need to do, and at the end of that, success. That's not how this is going to work. And with each passing season, summer and winter, we're learning more and more, and we can adapt to what we're seeing and the information we're getting so that we can be better prepared going forward.
Yeah. So my diagnosis of Uri, and obviously I've thought about this a lot and talked about it a lot, and listened a lot about this, read a lot about it. And you can agree or disagree with this, obviously. I think it was three things: weatherization of the gas supply system was not adequate, weatherization of power plants weren't adequate, and weatherization of our homes and buildings were not adequate. We had a spike in demand, much of that caused by resistance heat. This was talked about a lot yesterday. There was a whole panel on advanced heat pumps. So I guess, first of all, I can ask, do you kind of agree with that diagnosis that demand and sort of, wasted energy, inefficient use of energy, sort of inefficient heat in poorly insulated homes was sort of one of the main things? And if so, how do we address that?
Yeah, so I definitely do. I'd say the other part of that kind of encompasses everything and encircles it is poor communication. I think a lot of those issues, on the residential side could have been, the situation could have been ameliorated had we communicated better about what we thought was going to happen, because people could have made preparations. I think what you saw, at least in the data that I've seen, is when people would get their power back on for, an hour or 2 hours in that 5-day stretch, they would just crank up their heat and it set it to 90 and it would just constantly run because they were afraid that their homes were going to lose power again and they wanted to heat it. And then if that didn't happen, because they never knew if it would happen, they just kept their thermostats where they were. And yes, I think it is fair to say that if everyone was receiving electricity during that time period, the amount of load that would have been on that we've tried to estimate would have been outrageous. I agree, as with most kind of retrofitting or any discussions around that, the question, to move away from resistance heating is going to be who's going to pay for that. This group may know better than me. I've seen estimates for retrofitting a standard house that, uses 1,200 megawatts on average throughout the year to install pumps would cost anywhere for some models between $1,500 all the way up. I've seen some systems can cost $35,000. And so as by experience and education, I have an economics background, so I think about vertical and horizontal equity in most things on the policy side that I think about. And, finding ways to ensure that everyone can participate in that and receive the benefits, I think is something that the state needs to be talking about, that groups like this need to be talking about. Because, yeah, I think it would help. It helps on bills, helps on the affordability side. I think it helps on the environmental side and sustainability side, and obviously would help us if you can see a reduction in heating of up to 65% by switching away from, to pumps from resistance heating. That's obviously a benefit to the system, which is something we need because, as we're seeing this expansion, that's not just an expansion when I talk about it of resources. The megawatt we're not using is just as valuable as the megawatt we're generating. And so I think it's incumbent on us to have those discussions on both sides of the equation. And, one of the things I'm excited about, recently we've set up, and I think you all heard from Ramaswamy yesterday, a division of efficiency, of energy efficiency. And she's going to be working with Commissioner Jackson on our energy efficiency initiatives and our demand response initiatives. And so I think that'll definitely help. There was a bill, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Doug, last session to kind of put together an advisory council on these things. I think we probably got started a little too late in the process. And a lot of folks had a lot of ideas. So I think that just kind of died on the vine. I'm hopeful that if we start earlier going into this session, we'll have a much broader and deeper conversation about energy efficiency and demand response at the legislature.
Yeah, I do think it's a really big step to have an energy efficiency division. I mean, in some ways it's disappointing it took this long, but you can only deal with what you got and deal with where you are and go forward from there. And I think setting up the division is a huge step.
Yeah. And I think you're right. It is unfortunate. And most of the time, I don't know if many of you have ever worked in government or state government, we're resourced in a way typically where what you focus on is subject to kind of an acute onset issue that is in front of you. Right. And so, I think often to my 15, 16 years at the commission, for most of that up until Uri, we focused on regulated utilities and rate cases. Our former executive directors have gotten involved, in those types of issues, not really involved in market issues. If you ever saw one of our open meetings pre-Uri, there were not constant discussions about ERCOT and market design.
They were like 30 minutes.
Yeah. And so, it took that event to really refocus us. And I think as we've done a lot on the market design side, on trying to incent generation, I think it's just natural that now we have to pivot to the other side of that equation and start to focus on the demand side as well. And I think we will do that.
When we were talking before we came up here, you said you wanted this to be a conversation and not just me asking you questions. Sure. So I'm gonna use that license you gave me and just talk about energy efficiency for just a minute. And I'll say again, we're at the SPEER industry conference. There are exhibitors here from Daikin and Mitsubishi that make heat pumps. And I will say the costs are coming down. We're not seeing a cost decline like solar in batteries. It's not 90% over 10 years, but there are cost declines happening. They are happening pretty rapidly as heat pumps are scaling around the world. The International Energy Agency is putting out reports on heat pumps. Like, this is a global phenomenon, and we are starting to see those costs come down. You talked about 2011 after that winter storm, and I agree. I don't think the state did a lot of the things it should have done. One of the recommendations from FERC and NERC following Winter Storm Uri was to implement more energy efficiency. And I understand you guys are taking steps. There's an energy efficiency division, but that's not the same as actually getting the savings. And what we see with resistance heat, and this is in the FERC and NERC report, there was a UT study on this, a home that has resistance heat, they have a scatter plot, right? So there's a range, but we'll use 2 to 4 times as much power at 14 degrees. And of course, Uri was far colder than 14 degrees than that same home at 100 degrees. 2 to 4 times as much. So you're talking about an extra 5, 10 kW per home, and there's 4 million homes in Texas with resistance heat. So ERCOT had estimated during Uri 77 gigawatts of demand. There's an A&M research team that had 82 as their estimate. There's a UT estimate that's somewhere between the range of 87 to 92 gigawatts of load during Winter Storm Uri, driven by resistance heat. You don't have to respond to all that. I just think it's really important, and I hope that you'll have a chance to talk to the Daikin and Mitsubishi and LG, all these companies that are, I've left some out, Carrier, Train. I love them all. I'm not trying to play favorites here. But the technology is advancing very fast. There's a lot of options in the market. And I just want to, just one last thing, and then I'm going to turn it back to you, because I think your point about equity is very important. We have to make sure that as we have these incentive programs, it's not only people that are making 6 figures that can access them. Of course, the PUC has low-income programs. Maybe that's an area where we could really look at talking about an energy expansion, expanding what we're doing for folks that are, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, 57% of Texans are choosing between food, medicine, and paying their power bill. Like 57, that's just a shocking number. So maybe that's an area to look at, is really kind of expanding those low-income programs.
Yeah, no, I think so. If you'll remember back, the low-income discount and the system benefit fund that funded that kind of always became kind of a political issue, because that was a dedicated fund in the Treasury, which in lean times in the state budget, the corpus of that fund was used to balance the budget. And so I think that was one of the kind of failures of that ultimately was, the legislature had an incentive to not spend all that money, and for the purposes it was being collected for. So as I've had conversations about this, I've talked about, the way you would want to do it is set it up outside the Treasury, so there's no incentive from on the state side, if we ever run into budget issues again, to not spend all that money for what's being collected on. The other thing is, in this environment, the chances of a new assessment being tacked onto bills, as we're talking about affordability, is probably not one that's realistic. But we do have surpluses. We run surpluses. We have a lot of money in the Economic Stabilization Fund. This is a direct way for the state to get behind affordability, is to allocate some of that money to a fund outside the Treasury that we can then look at how to best spend it. And I think, obviously bill credits is one. One of the big impediments I hear often from the retail electric providers is we have to get smart thermostats in everyone's home. They're not excited about doing that because they don't want to put in that cost on the front end just to have someone leave them. Well, if the state funded that, we wouldn't have to worry about that. And, and everyone benefits from having, low-income customers be able to participate in programs like that. And so, yeah, I think you're right. A broadening in all senses. As far as resistance heating, I think it's something we need to deal with. I would say from the commission side, and this is why, I'm hopeful that we'll get a broader coalition to support, an advisory committee on this. We have just our small slice of that policy. We don't deal with building codes on energy efficiency. We don't deal with the litany of other issues. So I think it's important to get buy-in for something that I think is this important from a broad coalition of folks from a lot of different industries and a lot of different regulatory partners that have different regulatory oversight of the areas around energy efficiency that can be most beneficial.
Yeah. And, yesterday, this audience heard from Eddie Trevino from the State Energy Conservation Office. They're about to have some dollars through the Homes and Here program to spend on low income energy efficiency. So yeah, coordination is key. There's obviously, though, some that could be done through the efficiency programs that you guys have right now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have existing programs and you can always increase those. I would say, though, similar to what my feelings are on market design, a lot of times we look at kind of one knob and either dial it up or dial it down without really looking at what the total impact could be if we looked at all the different knobs together and how the interplay between those would most effectively and efficiently be utilized. So I would argue, just from a policy standpoint, it's probably better to get a comprehensive view and then funnel down into which knob you need to turn based on the full litany of options in front of you, as opposed to just focusing on what one regulatory body can do in a vacuum.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm all for, I think, the bigger view. And you were talking about planning earlier, like you have to have that view if you're going to have effective planning. Just on this vein, I do want to shift gears and ask you about some other things, but Texas is one of a minority of states that does not track utility shutoff. Well, maybe tracks, doesn't report utility shutoffs. I wonder if that's not when I hear numbers like the 57% from the Federal Reserve, I think the census puts the number at 45%, but like somewhere around half a family pay their bills, and yet we don't know how many are being shut off. I wonder if that's a way to connect those dots to solve multiple problems. You're dealing with the reliability piece. If you're switching out resistance heat, you're dealing with the affordability piece. If yes, sometimes people just need a bill credit just to get to the next month, but then they're going to be back in that position a couple months down the road unless there's some energy efficiency done. I wonder if a first step isn't simply tracking and reporting the shutoffs and then trying to connect people before they're shut off to some kind of aid, both short-term and longer term in terms of energy efficiency.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think data around that, needs to be measured so you can see what the actual impact is. One of the things we hear quite often, obviously in our rules, we have moratoriums on disconnect during certain extreme weather periods. We'll hear from customers and get complaints that they weren't disconnected. They continue to rack up bills, and then they can't afford now this giant bill that they have on the back end of that. And so I think you're right. Simply not disconnecting people is not the answer because it doesn't address the affordability aspect of that.
The bill's still there after.
That's right. And they won't be able to switch, and it can become a problem, and you're just digging a hole you can't get out of more and more. And so, no, I think you're right. I think as we look at affordability, whether it's bill credits, whether it's weatherization of residential homes for low income folks or for all folks, in all honesty, I think, like I said, my heart is focusing on low income folks because I cut my teeth in a lot of these programs on the low income side. But, I think in order for the system to benefit to the maximum extent it can, we have to make those types of programs something that everyone is focused on. So just because low income folks may be able to get a discount doesn't solve the problem that I don't know that a lot of, folks in different socioeconomic situations think about the benefit of upgrading their windows so that they keep more heat or air conditioning in. Think about, the seals around their windows, their doors. Think about the insulation in their attics. I don't know that there's necessarily always a direct connection in people's minds that they see in the summer a $600 bill and they go, I need to use less energy. And they think about turning their thermostat up and down as opposed to saying, I'm using too much energy. How can I keep my house where I'm comfortable, but
or be more comfortable
and not pay the bill that I'm paying? And I think, a lot of that's around education. As you know, we've started a division of public outreach at the commission. And that's one of the things that Mike Hoke, who used to be our governmental relations director, does when he goes out into communities, is talks to folks about these kind of issues that I don't think are front of mind. We're in the industry. I talk about this all the time. We probably talk about it all the time. I don't think communities out there, especially the smaller ones, really think about the benefits that are out there to making changes to their homes. And so I think that's one of our goals is to just educate folks on what they can do on the affordability side. Anywhere that the state can help out, I think it should.
Yeah, you guys have an important role there. I'm glad to hear that's part of the mission. And I'll just say before I do want to shift gears a little bit, but you're right. There's a lot of energy efficiency potential in some of the higher socioeconomic strata as well. There are tax credits available there, and they're I believe it's capped at this is not tax advice. Please check with your tax attorney, but or your accountant, whatever. But you can get, I believe, $2,000 per year. So we're recording here in September. People hear this in the fall. You can do 2,000 this calendar year, another 2,000 beginning of next year, whether it's windows or a heat pump or insulation. But of course, you have to have a tax burden for that to be meaningful. So the low income programs are very important. I do want to shift gears a little bit. Obviously, Hurricane Beryl happened a couple months ago. It's had a whole lot of attention. There's a lot of different things we could talk about related to that, and I'm happy for you to say whatever you want to say on that. But the question I want to ask you, you had a really interesting exchange with the I believe it was actually this special committee. I was going to say it was Business and Commerce, but there was a special committee on hurricane response and preparedness. And Senator Kolkhorst was talking to you about this. She said, looking at incentives, do the incentives of utilities align with their customers? And she added, I'm just going to tell you, it does not. I don't really feel like we have a performance-based system. You responded, I don't either. While there is statutory language that says we can reduce return on based on their performance, you said that power has only been used once. So obviously, I heard this quote recently. I'll give credit where it comes from. It was the Volts podcast. Dave Roberts with Charles Watt was talking about utility regulation, and I think it was Charles that had said something like the regulatory system might be even more outdated than the infrastructure we're trying to update. I thought that was a great quote. I mean, it's a regulatory model that comes from 100 years ago that was at a time where they were trying to attract capital just to electrify. And so you have this sort of guaranteed return on equity. So my question for you is, does that need to change? Do we need to be looking at some system that is more geared towards the outcomes we want to see on the distribution grid? Or can that old model actually kind of work, and we don't need to look at that as much?
Yeah, I think it can work. I don't know if it can work well. And so, one of the things I talked to through that special committee, we ended up interacting, particularly on the House side, with a number of members who we normally don't interact with. And, actually went through the exercise with one House member of this is how a rate is made. We spent probably 90 minutes in the PUC offices going through this. And that member was surprised at kind of how revenues flowed to transmission distribution utilities. One of the eye-opening things in particular was, we talk a lot about vegetation management coming out of Beryl. I think that has proven, will continue to prove to be the major issue that we had was vegetation management was just suboptimal. The utility has an incentive post rate case to reduce O&M costs because they earn a recovery of those costs, but not a return on those costs. So if they're looking to maximize the amount of money that they spend on the capital, the capital side of the rate equation, so that their shareholders can earn a return on that, they're going to cut from O&M expense, which is where in a rate case, vegetation management is. But, and if you've seen any of the discussion about this or any of the articles, what we'll now see is a contested case go through the commission where those costs related to Beryl can be securitized and paid out over 30 years for the restoration costs. The vegetation management through that case is considered capital. So you have this odd incentive to decrease your vegetation management on the front end in the rate case, because if you have to do restoration on the back end that includes vegetation management, you earn a return on that. And so that's just one example. I don't think anyone, I don't think that was done on purpose. I'm sure those things were done, not synchronously. And so one statute was done and then another one. But, that's just one of those areas where I think about that's probably not the incentive that we want. We want the incentives to line up, do everything you need to do on the front end so you don't have to do it on the back end, because the ratepayer is paying for it one way or another, and they're paying for it a lot more on the back end. So we need to provide incentives and set up an incentive framework that gives them that sets forth what our goal is, which is do this on the front end so we're not having to do restoration, and the economic incentives need to be lined up that way.
Yeah, there's a great paper I'll put in the show notes, and for anybody in the room, I can I can help you find it later if you can't find it, but it's RMI does this. It's called like their 4 pillars, I think, of utility regulation or performance-based regulation reform. And one of those is what they call TOTEX, that like instead of earning a return on CapEx, you're earning a return on the combined CapEx and O&M. So you remove that disincentive. Vegetation management is one of them, and it's a really big one, obviously, in terms of Hurricane Beryl. But I also think there's some misaligned incentive for helping customers to get their own generation, whether that's solar or storage or a gas generator, be more energy efficient, all that stuff. Just like you said, I don't think it's like utilities sitting around saying, we don't want people to get that. It's more, how do you make the incentive so they wake up every day saying, my customer's interest is my interest?
Yeah, right. Because I mean, those transmission distribution companies make money by customers taking power off the grid. So yeah, there's definitely not the incentive to, on the utility side to have customers, need less energy. And so, I think you're right. I think, and that takes a broad discussion. I'm not going to claim to be well-versed enough or smart enough to know what changes, whether they're, very big changes, or maybe they're just marginal changes that we can look at. One of the unfortunate parts about this is the resiliency plans that are getting filed, after the legislation from last session were not filed, and nothing had been really decided prior to Beryl. I'll say the other thing that we kind of have to change is, I think if any of you have participated in a rate case at the commission, you typically at the beginning, you're trying to decide how big the pie is, right? What the revenue requirement is. And you typically have everyone against the utility, right? All of the people that are going to pay the rates want to shrink that pie. The utility wants to make it as big as possible. Then the second part of that is the allocation. The utility at that point doesn't care, right? They know they're going to get their revenue. It's everyone else now fighting to lessen their share of that pie. I think what this has shown is constantly having parties in these cases take the stance of, we have to reduce rates, is also probably not pragmatic, because one of the things that gets cut a lot in those rate cases is O&M expense related to vegetation management. And again, if you take, a city, for instance, who may argue that we need to reduce rates, well, this is an outflow of that stance sometimes, that proper vegetation management isn't done. And I think if you could go back now, in any of these restoration cases, not just Beryl, and ask customers, would we have been willing to pay a little more through O&M on vegetation management to not deal with these long outages? I think they would say yes. And so I think that's another area that there needs to be a pivot on, not everyone just trying to shrink that pie to the lowest number it can be.
Yeah, and that probably, to come back to where we started, we were talking about planning. You were talking about planning at the very beginning. Do we need some different kind of a distribution resource planning? A lot of states have what are called integrated resource plans. We don't have those here because we have a competitive generation market. So you as a regulator aren't picking what kind of generation goes where. Competitive forces determine that. The distribution system, still very much centrally planned with a regulator overseeing it. Do we need to do planning different on the distribution side?
I think we do. I think we need to look at a broader horizon more than anything. I think there's in every kind of plan and rate case, there's a focus just on the kind of immediate needs of the system. And again, no one, we're concerned about affordability. So no one wants, what, industry terms, gold plating of systems or things like that. But again, if you're not looking at the interplay between everything that you're doing, I think it's just not going to work as well. I think you have to take a holistic view of what you're doing. And I think a resource plan like that would be helpful. I think, one of the things we'll see in the resiliency plans that are filed, that is forcing the companies that follow those resiliency plans to think comprehensively about their entire system, where the vulnerabilities may be, and how to harden that so that their entire system is resilient.
I want to leave about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, be thinking of that now. Get yourself ready. I'm not ready for questions yet. I'm going to ask you 2 more if that's all right, and then we'll do questions.
Yeah, and just so you know, my chief of staff is here. She'll be taking names of everyone, so
so ask nice questions. So I want to ask you also about the Texas Energy Fund. So the Texas Energy Fund, for folks who don't know, the legislature passed in Senate Bill 2627, a bill that puts $10 billion towards 3 things. It's really 4, but let's just call it 3 in ERCOT generation, out of ERCOT generation, and then what is called the Texas Power Promise or the backup power package. The legislature appropriated 5 of that 10. And so far, y'all have, and I know you had statutory deadlines to do this. You guys have focused on the in ERCOT large sort of central station gas plant piece of that. My question is, after Hurricane Beryl, where, what the backup power package specifically focuses on, if for folks that aren't following this, is microgrids at critical facilities, backup power packages that are a mix of solar storage and gas at places like nursing homes, assisted living facilities, fire departments, hospitals, right? Places that need to have fully reliable power. There, literally was, people that died at nursing homes. Barbara Sturgis, 93 years old in Houston. She lived through so many things in her life and didn't make it through Hurricane Beryl. And I take that, and I hope we all do in the industry, as a personal failure. That should not happen. And that means we collectively as a community aren't doing the right things. That should never happen again. Are you going to, with that $5 billion, spend some on the microgrids, or is it all going towards gas plants? How are you sort of staging that? My worry, just to put my cards on the table here, Chairman, is that we don't know what the next legislature is going to do. There might be $5 billion more, there might not. But there's $5 billion there now. And my concern is that these backup power packages are not going to get to nursing homes and hospitals, and the next hurricane hits, and there's going to be more people losing their life needlessly.
Yeah, so I'll say that decision hasn't been made yet. We approved a suite of projects, initially 17, now 16, that, you're right, would eat up all of that $5 billion plus the interest we expect to accrue over the short period. We're going to have to make that decision depending on how discussions go around the remaining $5 billion that could be appropriated to us. That decision probably has to be made in February, whether or not we're going to pull projects back to fund these other programs, or we're going to move forward. I'm hopeful. I'm sure you all have seen or are aware kind of what happened the last couple of weeks with the inside ERCOT loan piece. If you saw my testimony to State Affairs, I implored Senate Finance. I implored the Finance Committee to give us that other $5 billion. And one of the main reasons is because the backup power package, I think, is something that will be extremely helpful to your list of critical infrastructure. I'd probably add Buc-ee's, maybe HEB.
Well, and people laugh, but like during, and it is kind of funny, but it's not also, because during Winter Storm Uri, right, the famous 4 minutes, 37 seconds from an actual blackout, right? The difference in the industry between rolling outages and that, I'm well aware they didn't roll, but the whole grid didn't go down. And if the whole grid had gone down, it might have taken weeks, maybe even a month to bring it back up. And that means, by the way, fueling stations don't work. So people can't get out of the state. There's no power and you don't have gas in your car, you can't go anywhere, right? So like Buc-ee's actually do need fully reliable power.
That's right. Yeah. And, a lot of Buc-ee's and HEBs have backup power, thankfully. But yeah, I think those types of facilities, in local communities that would be helped and help the community to ensure that they had power for, 48 hours, which is, I think, what we're going to ask for the backup power package to allow for. The benefit of the backup power package, you're talking about the next hurricane. Once those funds are allocated, that can be done really quickly. I think of all of the 3 programs, the funds spent in the backup power package can be effectively spent sooner than any of the other programs. And so, what we're waiting on right now, there's an advisory committee. They plan to have a report to us, I think early October 1st. We also, per statute, were required to hire a research entity to help inform our decisions about who to give loans to and what characteristics are. They've submitted a preliminary report. We're still waiting on their final report. I think that's probably mid to late October. And once that's done, we'll start the rulemaking process. I think on staff's timeline, they hope to have the rule for that to be published and in front of us sometime in December, which would then kick off our 6 months to come to a decision. And so, no, I will continue to implore the legislature to give us that other $5 billion so that we can fulfill the promise of the entire legislation of Senate Bill 2627, in particular on the backup power piece, because that money can pay dividends almost immediately and much sooner than the other programs.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I'm critical of the PUC a lot. Some of you sitting there might be going, we need to spend this money. I do want to just convey, and I understand this, I hope everybody understands this. There was a statutory deadline put in there for the larger gas plants that you had to comply with. you guys are not a particularly large agency. You're very small relative to like TCEQ or Railroad Commission. You guys are given a lot on your plate. You're stretched too thin. So I just want to recognize that. But I also think there's the potential here with, there were 17 projects, now there's 16, to do some kind of competition within there where the top 3/4 make it, and then there's some money left for backup power. But my 2 cents.
Yeah, and we'll have, there's an advisory committee for the TEF, and we're going to have a hearing there on October 8th. So I'm sure we'll get some feedback. And again, I can't stress it enough. I think we need the full $10 billion to do everything that was in that bill, because it was the last bill filed. It was filed late May 1st, 2023, maybe the latest in my time in dealing with the legislature I've ever seen a bill filed. But I think the reason
and passed, like it was wild,
and passed overwhelmingly with full support. And so I think to fulfill the promise of all of the provisions of that legislation, we need the full $10 billion. This went before the voters. The voters authorized this to be spent. So I think it would really not fulfill the promise of the legislation if we didn't have access to and use the full $10 billion.
One last thing before we open up to questions. You guys are doing a hearing in Houston on October 5th. I don't know if somebody can put in the comments of this podcast, or if you're in the room, you can say when you stand up. I've been asking a lot of people. I have not been able to find somebody that can tell me there's been a Public Utility Commission meeting outside of Austin anytime in the last 25 years.
Not that I can remember. I know they did when we were going through restructuring and opening the market.
In the 90s.
Former Chair Pat Wood held, I believe, hearings across the state to get folks, engaged on that, to educate people and hear their thoughts. But yes, in my time with the PUC since 2008, we've never held a hearing anywhere but Austin.
So I give you a lot of credit for doing that. I want to ask you, what do you hope to accomplish with that hearing? Kind of give people a little sense of what's going to happen there and what they can expect, what you hope to accomplish. And I'm also wondering, is that a one-off, or are you going to kind of get around the state a little bit and listen to people more?
So I think it'll be a one-off for Beryl-related issues. I think what it will probably help inform going forward is when we have issues that are kind of localized issues, what our outreach is to those communities. I don't know that we're going to want to spend the money to have many hearings, outside of Austin, because that's a lot of staff that are traveling, that are using state funds for that. But I think where appropriate, it's definitely worth a conversation. What I'm trying to get out of this, and the reason that we're doing it is, we opened kind of a portal where anyone in the Gulf Coast area that had issues or had thoughts could submit their thoughts, ideas, and complaints to the commission. I want to say we've gotten somewhere between 10 and 20,000 responses.
Still open?
Is still open.
Okay, so people are hearing this and didn't know about it. They can, and there's, I think, right on your main page. There's
a link, and so we've had so much outreach on this. I think it's in our interest. I think it's in the interest of a good process to allow folks to come and speak to us directly. Initially the thought was we do this as just a typical open meeting on a Thursday. I advised against that, and we're doing it on a Saturday because I want people not to have to take off of work to come do this. It's going to be, we have our facility that the mayor of Houston, John Whitmire, was able to get for us from, I believe, 9 a.m. is when we plan to start, and we don't have an end time, so we'll hear from as many people as want to speak to us. I believe, a large part of the Houston delegation will be there. CenterPoint will be there. I think we'll have representatives from the Division of Emergency Management and other local entities out there as well. And it's really just a chance to hear from the people that were directly impacted without having them, the need to come all the way to Austin. We can go to them and hear them out. Most of the issues that you'd ever see on an open meeting related to Beryl or to CenterPoint will be posted so that we can have a full discussion about everything that's in front of us and not kind of predetermine where that discussion goes. Everything will be kind of up for grabs as to what we talk about, and hopefully we'll leave there better informed as we have to make some critical decisions in the short term around issues related to Beryl.
Yeah, I again commend you for doing that. I think it's really, really important, and hope that even if it's not, full workshops or open meetings or whatever, the late Brad Jones, who was the CEO of ERCOT, was going around the state doing town halls. You're here. You're clearly like wanting to do that, and I just think it's so important. There's there's a bubble around the PUC in Austin, and it's important to kind of
there is, and like I said, we have our division of public engagement that goes out, but I think it's important for the commissioners to get out as well, to hear from folks from our executive staff, to get out there and hear from folks who are the ones impacted by the decisions that we're making.
All right, let's open it up to questions. Who wants to ask the first one? All right, I see Kaiba and Cyrus. Go ahead.
Thank you. Kaiba White with Public Citizens Texas office. Thank you, Chairman, for your comments this morning. Really appreciate a lot that I'm hearing from you. As I was brushing my teeth this morning, a friend texted me about crypto mining and AI increasing demand in Texas and elsewhere. And I'll say this friend has very different political views than I do and does not work in energy. So this is just, kind of on his mind outside of anything professionals, which I think indicates that it's something that people are becoming aware of and are concerned about. And I know that you're aware of it. A lot of us are, but I have yet to hear that there's any solution on the horizon for, how to bring that under control. Because it seems like just building more generation is not going to be the answer because it's just sky high. So wondering what ideas you have for the state of Texas to get that problem under control.
So, no, I appreciate that question. And I think you're right. This is something, as I hope we pivot away from market design dominating legislative sessions, crypto and AI data center loads, I think and transmission are going to have take a lot of the oxygen out of the room in the next legislative session. The first thing, and I think the easiest thing to do, is to make crypto miners controllable load resources. This is something we've talked to the Bitcoin Council about and to ERCOT. We hear anecdotally when we talk to crypto miners that they're price sensitive, that at a certain point, let's just say $500 a megawatt, that they come off. I can say from the data I've seen, that's generally true, but not always true. And you'll see some interesting behavior when you look at it, where a lot of that load will come off, but then even at a higher number, come back on. I assume a lot of that has to do with the real-time price of Bitcoin and what kind of hedging they're looking at. So I think the first thing is to make those loads controllable resources by ERCOT, so that if we see a problem coming, they can be turned down to help the grid. Beyond that, it's probably going to take a lot of legislative change. One idea I have heard talked about is potentially coming up with a new class in tariffs to treat those loads differently than, say, other large industrial loads, because they have different characteristics. I imagine, as the regulator, I never want to say we don't have the authority to do something until someone tells me we don't. I would probably guess, even if we have the authority to do that, some other industrial customers would want to ensure that they don't get brought into any kind of policy change around that, and may want to see legislative action on that, so we can have a robust discussion during the legislative session. But I think those are two things that are pretty low-hanging fruit that we can deal with, making those loads controllable, and then seeing if their characteristics necessitate having a different section in the tariff for them, so that they're charged differently for their consumption.
Hello, good to see you.
Doug told me I get one veto, so I will use it.
Next question, please. No. Next question.
No. This
is Cyrus Reed of the Sierra Club, for those that are listening to the podcast.
Thank you for what I think was your continued support for the idea of a Texas Energy Efficiency Council. I think I heard that. So that's not my question. I'm getting a nod, so I'll take that as a yes. Second, Doug asked you about the need for planning in the distribution grid. I don't want to talk about ERCOT. I want to talk about outside of ERCOT. Is it time to have integrated resource planning for the vertically integrated utilities like we used to have, so that Sierra Club doesn't have to go and make comments every time there's a new tariff that Entergy has, every time they want to build a gas plant or add solar plants? Should we be having a public process to plan for the next 20 years where stakeholders and shareholders and others can have that discussion, and then that can help guide those upcoming tariffs and the individual decisions?
So I think I'm not going to say whether we should or shouldn't. I think there are definitely benefits to having integrated resource plans. I think if you talk to the vertically integrated utilities outside of ERCOT and how they operate in other jurisdictions, and what the benefits of an IRP are, I think there's definitely benefit to that. I will say I don't know if there is an appetite to go back to IRP in Texas. I will, honestly, that wasn't around when I got involved in this. I've heard both sides of it from folks, kind of the benefits and then, kind of the negative aspects of trying to plan for that long a period of time and so many things changing that you end up kind of doing the IRP continuously. And so maybe it's not the panacea or the catch-all to deal with all the issues that you're talking about. But again, I don't think that I don't have the ego to say that we shouldn't discuss changes everywhere that people think there is benefit. So, what I'll say is if that is something that folks feel there's benefit to doing, we should have that discussion. One of the things I've committed to, and I know, Cyrus, obviously, all joking aside, you're very active at the commission and we appreciate that. One of the things I always ask people is if you have an issue with what we're doing, come tell us, because the first time I hear something shouldn't be at the legislature during a hearing. And you're great about that, and I appreciate it. So if there is an appetite to have that discussion, I think it's a discussion we should absolutely have. You may not always agree with where we end up in a decision, but I've committed since I took this job, and I think it was also the way I operate as executive director. Even if you don't agree with where we are or where we got, I will try my damnedest to ensure you understand how we got there. And so if that's a discussion that you think there's value in, I'm absolutely open to having that conversation.
All right, next question.
I'm Swift Braddock. I'm with Metco Engineering. And Doug introduced the Texas backup power a moment ago. Really, I'm going to ask, I think it's a simple question, and I may even have the answer, but I'd like for you to confirm it, Chairman, if you would. So, that legislation, the 2627, is that the bill number?
Yes, sir.
I believe that was all done with the intent to keep the lights on, so to speak. The two parts with the Texas Energy Fund with 100 megawatt, and then the backup power packages kind of behind the meter. And if I'm not mistaken, I think, like I say, it's resiliency was what was in mind. But coming from the industry, which most of the people in here are kind of on the backside of the meter, we're not really power plant type people. You think about the backup power package, it's got solar, it's got battery, it's got a generator, it's got all that working cohesively, to keep the lights on behind the meter. So what I'm really pointing out is that legislation does more than just keep the lights on. It's working with sustainability, energy efficiency, decarbonization, and several other benefactors that are in there, whereas the power plant side of it is just strictly, generation on the grid. So here's my question, having said all of that. I'm concerned about regulators, like the PUC, utilities, and policymakers not being fully aware of the impact of some of our legislation like that. This could be very far-reaching, having little miniature microgrids and so forth. So here's the question. The question is, how do those of us in the room that are in this industry and we see all these great benefits and potential that is behind some of these bills, be sure that you, the regulators, are fully aware of what the impacts are. Like even right now, a couple of people have said that he's definitely an old guy because he's not using a computer. I printed out a FOIA, from the DOE, and it's something that we're responding to, and it's got you mentioned in there. Really, it's saying public utility commissions need to be participants in this because what the DOE is interested in seeing is planning at the PUC level would adapt and accommodate, these innovations like the backup power packages. So that's a long question.
So the question is really like, how can people inform the commission? Like if you're working in industry and you see things going on, how do you
I'd like
communicate?
to read what the DOE's after.
Yeah.
If we can get passionate about this because it has such far-reaching benefits, efficiency, sustainability, decarbonization, as well as resiliency. So you're in a great position to help be the conduit from the behind the meter to the utility to setting policy. So is there any comments you could offer regarding all that?
Sure, and I think you're right. It is probably a simple answer I have for you, and it's one word, and it's engage. Right, as we hear often from different folks, the P in PUC stands for public, and we don't turn down meetings if we're heading down a path that you disagree with or you think we are misinformed or not fully informed. If there's an information asymmetry out there, then come tell us. Our staff, our executive staff, Connie Corona and Barksdale English, our executive director and deputy executive director, are always willing to meet with folks. Like I said, Cyrus is heavily engaged, and I think would attest to the fact that we meet with folks, so we can hear all sides of an issue. The other thing I would say is engage on the front end. You're talking about legislation. Engage in the process during a legislative session and leading up to one, whether it's your company or an association, because I think a lot of times we find, and if you ever look at any of our dockets, we get letters quite often from members who pass legislation. We think it means one thing, and we get a letter saying this was my legislative intent because you are not doing what we thought you were supposed to be doing. Anything we can do to avoid that is obviously beneficial to everybody. So my answer would be engage. Don't wait till the policy's in place and then say, we don't like what you did, because that's not helpful. Engage throughout the process, be an active stakeholder if it affects you. And that, I think, produces the best policy outcome. Again, we may hear what you have to say and disagree that that's the intent or that's what the policy should be, but we will absolutely listen to your perspective and take that into consideration and form our decision.
And I'll also just reiterate something you said earlier. There is an Office of Public Engagement at the PUC now as well. So if you are not sure where to plug in, that's a great place to start. Do your initial inquiry there, and they can direct you. We'll put a link to that office in our show notes.
Perfect. And I don't know if you have much experience interacting with agencies. I'm biased, but I would argue our process is extremely transparent. Everything gets filed is in our interchange. Everyone can see it. There's full transparency on what is being filed and what information we're taking in. So engage in that process, and we will give your information the same consideration we give to any other party.
Who's getting the last question? Go ahead, say your name and who you're with, please.
Kyla McNabb, energy consultant with that state to the north that will not be named.
Not ranked number one in football, that one?
Rebuilding. So going back to a larger picture, I think my work within the Southwest Power Pool, that we see a lot of conversations happening following through Winter Storm Uri. Southwest Power Pool sending down as much energy as we can through the grid. Wondering your thoughts, both probably philosophically as well as practically, about how we can tie in the grids better and what that means to enable more power to be transferred between the interconnections.
So, I don't think there's an appetite to interconnect AC lines from other grids. We have about 1,300 megawatts of DC connections to other grids. As I've looked at this, there are benefits and, to being kind of an island. One of them is, post Uri, we've made a lot of changes that would not have been in effect if we were FERC jurisdictional at this point. In fact, the feds are using what we've done as a framework for what they're pushing out, at the federal level. If you look at Uri, especially on the east side of the state, even if we had AC connections to other grids, those grids needed all the energy that they were producing to stay there. So I'm doubtful as to what benefit that actually would have provided to Texas during Winter Storm Uri. There have definitely been discussions about longer lines. We hear about jumper cables, in case of extreme need. And I think we're open to those kinds of discussions. Any discussion about taking action that would make ERCOT FERC jurisdictional, I think, are non-starters in this state.
But there are FERC jurisdictional waivers for some projects, right? That could be DC connections.
That's correct.
Asynchronous.
And before anyone moves forward with those, we ensure that we have that waiver so that we are not FERC jurisdictional.
So we're going to end there. I want to just, in closing, thank you, Chairman, for not only doing this and being here among this really important group of stakeholders working on energy efficiency, but the way you're opening up process, trying to change process at ERCOT so that there's more ability for stakeholders to impact things. The public meeting in Houston, I am a firm believer that when you have a better process and more public participation, you get better outcomes. And really appreciate that you're moving that way. Anything else you want to say in closing? Anything I should have asked you that I didn't that you want to say in closing?
No, I appreciate this. Like I said, you and I don't get to interface too often. I see a lot of kind of new faces in here. So I'd say, come by, interface, interact with the commission. If you think it'd be beneficial, we're always happy to have those conversations and look forward to increasing engagement. Happy to, Krista, my chief of staff, will probably say we we do one of these at least every week at this point. And, as part of the commitment I made to the governor when I took this job was I would be out talking to everybody, ensuring that people felt they had a voice at the PUC. And so happy to be helpful in any way we can. If there's anything you need, to reach out. And Doug, I appreciate you offering this opportunity to me to talk to a new group. And if anyone wants to continue the discussion, I'll be sampling the IPAs down at the down the hallway a little. So,
and I will say there are at least a couple dozen questions I didn't get to on my list. So I'd love to have you back on the podcast at some point so we can dive into this.
Anytime.
Thank you for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please like, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, have a great day.